It has actively discouraged, and of course forbidden, discouraged European and other Western firms from developing and buying gas from Iran, forbidden, of course, American firms from doing so. And Russian business has benefited by being able to obtain opportunities for trade and investment in Iran that they might not have obtained had they had to compete with American and Western business to a greater extent. That we see now, of course, obviously, it was a Russian firm that took up the effort to complete the nuclear reactor, and they hope to sell more nuclear reactors. Russia sells arms. Russia sells passenger aircraft, and obviously that hasn't worked out so well recently. And Russian oil and gas interests are strongly pursuing opportunities in Iran, and they like that they don't have to face competition. All of these benefits could be lost if and when an Iranian-American rapprochement occurs, and the Russians acknowledge this explicitly. Now, finally, the third factor I think that has hindered the effort to improve relations is that the Obama administration's efforts to improve relations with both Russia and Iran, I think they've been partly unsuccessful because they were made simultaneously. Tehran saw American claims of wanting to improve relations as belied by American efforts to get Russia to toughen its position toward Iran on the nuclear issue. Similarly, Moscow saw the Obama administration's call for Moscow to help us with Iran appeared highly suspicious. Essentially, what Moscow saw was that Washington was asking Moscow to worsen its relations with Tehran over the nuclear issue so as to better position the U.S. to improve relations with Iran later on, thereby damaging Russian interests. This is basically how they saw the matter, and they obviously weren't going to be fooled by this. Now, underlying these Russian and Iranian views of what both saw as the Obama administration's nefarious aims is that both Moscow and Tehran have deep suspicion of each other, and both fear that the other might well sell out to America at its expense. Now, Iran, as is well known, has had many disputes with and grievances toward the United States, but Iran's disputes with and grievances toward Russia are, if anything, much greater and certainly more long-standing. Historical grievances that Iranians have, and which are continuously brought up in the Iranian press now, include the loss of territory to the Tsarist Empire in the early 19th century, the division of Iran into spheres of influence by the Russian and British empires later on in the 19th century, Tsarist intervention to quell Iran's constitutional revolution in the first decade of the 20th century, Soviet support for secession in northwestern Iran after both World War I and World War II, the occupation of Iran by the USSR and the United Kingdom during World War II, and Soviet support for Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War. These are just some of the grievances. Now, Russian-Iranian relations improved in the 1990s, but there are still many outstanding differences between them, including differences over the division of the Caspian. And, we could spend an entire session. In fact, I remember once here at Middle East Institute, we had an entire session just on this issue of the division of the Caspian. And I don't even want to get into it because it's so complex, and basically neither side is willing to compromise. The Iranians are very unhappy about repeated Russian delays in completing the Bushehr nuclear reactor. They were supposed to have completed this thing in 1999. And it hasn't been done yet. And each year they say, it's going to be completed by the end of this year or next year, and then the next year comes and the same thing happens. In 2007 they said 2008. In 2008 they said 2009. And just recently they've said, the beginning of 2010. But then if you kind of look at the fine print, well, actually not really the beginning of 2010, but after the beginning of the Iranian New Year in 2010, in March or something like that. But we'll see if it actually gets done. The Russians have been upset about Iran's rejection of Vladimir Putin's various proposals to enrich uranium for Iran. In other words, the current proposal for that we've seen by the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, to further refine some Iranian uranium for research purposes. This isn't the first time that the Russians have made an offer like this. That they really believe they have a solution to the Iranian crisis. And that solution is that Russia provides the enriched uranium at commercial grade. And thereby, Russia is important to Iran, keep the West off its back. Russia is important to the West for keeping the lid on Iran. And the Iranians won't play ball. They will not. They have not accepted these offers of the Russians, and it's usually at this point, in other words, when the Russians make such an offer, the Iranians hem and haw, and then finally come out and say, "Well, we'll accept it partially. You can enrich some of our uranium, but we're going to enrich some of our own." That's when the Russians vote for sanctions in the Security Council. And of course, Moscow's support for sanctions at all against Iran is something that the Iranians have been furious with. The Russians always, when they do this, they say, well, it could have been much worse. We actually watered down the sanctions that the Americans and the British wanted in particular, and so we actually helped you. But of course, the Iranians don't see it this way at all, and talk about the Russians in really scandalous terms. And most recently, the Iranians have been very upset about the another delay, this time in the delivery of Russian S-300 air defense systems to Iran. As you all know, there has been a lot of talk about the possibility of an Israeli attack on Iran to prevent it from, acquiring nuclear weapons. Iran has sought these S-300s as a means of blunting any such attack. And other parties, the United States, Israel in particular, have pressed Russia very hard on this. Now, Russia and Iran signed a contract, for these things. And they were supposed to have been delivered, I believe, last May to Iran. They haven't been delivered. And, what's the trouble? In other words, as far as the Iranians are concerned, the Russians are just doing it once again. And there have been other differences since the advent of the Obama administration. Foreign Minister Lavrov, for example, this past May, reiterated Putin's proposal that he made to then-President Bush that instead of the United States deploying ballistic missile defense systems in Poland and the Czech Republic, which Russia did not want us to do, that the U.S. and Russia share the radar station that the Russians have in Azerbaijan, and then the missiles actually be at a base in Russia. Now, I actually think the Russians, this was a genuine offer on their part. And I think we should have taken them up on this, if only because it infuriated the Iranians. And shortly after he first made the offer in 2007, Putin, in asking a question, answering a question about, would the Iranians be upset about this? And he just said no. But then it became very clear that they were upset about it. And yet they've reiterated this offer. And as far as the Iranians are concerned, this is proof once again that Russia is always willing to sell out to America against Iran. In other words, once the terms are right, this is what the Russians will do. They're not happy about this at all. And so actually, our Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, actually seemed to respond favorably to this idea last June, but then Moscow seemed to get cold feet.